gentlemen. Welcome to this new event of the Center for European Research. I'm Dr. Sarah Wolf. I'm the director of the center, which is hosted at the School of Politics and International Relations here at Queen Mary University, and I'm really pleased to welcome you all tonight for this very timely panel on how to reform Europe. The debate takes as a starting point Europe Reset, New Directions for the European Union, a book written by my colleague Richard Young, who is Senior Fellow at Carnegie Europe and who makes a series of bold propositions about the future of Europe. Richard is an expert on the foreign policy of the European Union and has written abundantly on the issue of democracy promotion towards the Middle East and North Africa. And his work on the EU-Mediterranean region has been a source of inspiration for many of us working in the area. Richard is also a professor at Warwick University, professor of international relations, and he has directed the European think tank Frida in Madrid. And I think you have also been a transatlantic fellow academic fellow in Washington. Before introducing the rest of the panel, however, let me introduce you again and remind you about who we are and what we do. So the Center is an interdisciplinary forum for the promotion of research and teaching on Europe. We provide a home for the many different facets of Europe. Our expertise covers European integration, comparative European politics, including British politics, and European Union studies. We host PhD students, postdocs, and welcome visiting fellows applications, including of practitioners. Tonight we're going to talk about what's next for Europe, which is also at the heart of the Centre's work. The BREXIT referendum, the rise of populism, Euroscepticism have proven that there is a real risk or real disengagement with Europe among citizens. And this requires, I think, further efforts of research on how to re-engage with Europe. So when I saw the book, I told myself, well, many have already written books about reforming Europe. I had in mind politicians, of course, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, Guy Verhofstadt, but also economists such as Joseph Stiglitz or Thomas Piketty all have their idea on how the European Union should look like. But I think your book, Richard, is really timely as it precisely highlights the needs for new ways of engaging citizens. You develop the concept of Eurocivismo, that is in the book, and I think you call for a Europe that should be participative, flexible, and secure. But you do it in a realistic way, and you try to move away from the old traditional templates of European integration. You develop a sharp criticism on the lack of democracy in the DNA of the European project, as well as the inability of policymakers and academics to think outside of the established frames of European integration. This debate also inaugurates the UAC's traveling exhibition of the Treaty of Rome 60th anniversary that you can visit after this event downstairs in the foyer during the drinks, to which you are all very much welcome. I'm also extremely pleased to have such a great panel of discussants who will react to your proposition. We have Professor Kalypso Nicolaides from Oxford University, who is a renowned expert on democracy and EU foreign policy, and Stella Ladi, who is senior lecturer here at Queen Mary University in public management and has written a lot on austerity politics and the Greek crisis. So we have, I think, a panel that is quite Greek and cosmopolitan to react to your propositions. I also need to indicate to you to pay attention to the fire exits, which are over there, I think in here. And please do not leave your bags unattended. Without further ado, Richard, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the invitation and to everybody for turning out. The starting point for my book is a situation that we are all very aware of, that over the last decade the EU has suffered a number of different crises. The euro crisis, the crisis of refugees, populism, various security challenges. My book argues that underneath all these individual crises there is something structurally remiss with the basic model of European integration. So I think one of the lessons of all the troubles that the EU has suffered over the last decade is that we need to rethink the basic model of European cooperation. I'm not saying anything particularly new or original or even radical in making that proposition. Many analysts have been arguing this for many years. Many European leaders themselves have called on numerous occasions for a fundamental rethink of the way we do European cooperation. My basic contribution to the debate is to suggest a number of very concrete and practical ways in which the EU could be made more participative, the way it could include its citizens in a more meaningful way in its most important decisions, and also how the EU could be made more flexible. So those are my twin propositions. The issue now is that there's relatively little momentum behind the search for fundamentally different models of European integration, even though leaders frequently say that this is a very important imperative. We all know the situation during 2017 has improved markedly since the beginning of the year, but the basic structural problems of European cooperation have not been resolved. You all know now it's a very positive situation that we are in a more optimistic phase, and relatively ambitious ideas for deepening integration are being put back on the agenda. Most of these ideas follow relatively traditional and familiar templates for European cooperation. Ideas for economic union, fiscal union, security union, defence union or political union are all very much back on the agenda. Clearly a very positive state of affairs, but there is a danger, I would argue, that if leaders now begin to make significant leap forward in integration and do it without the full participation of European citizens, this simply could be counterproductive and be storing up further problems in European integration over the long term. The point of my book is not to argue that these potential advances in European integration, economic union or political union, are necessarily bad or that they are not needed. Rather, my argument is that the political process, the basic political process through which we get to this deeper integration, does need to be rethought. Here, the sobering situation is that in the worst moments of the crisis, leaders were calling up to suggest that the basic model of European integration needed to be revived and rethought. But then nothing happened. Very, very little happened to inject any kind of qualitatively new ideas into the European Union. What we have basically is what I call in the book a kind of catch-22 impasse. The problem is that in the worst moments of crisis, leaders say basically the situation is so bad that we can't possibly take on board fundamental reform to the European Union. It's enough simply to be dealing with the worst of the crisis, and so leaders find themselves in a kind of crisis management mode. Then as soon as the EU comes out of its crisis, in effect leaders breathe a collective sigh of relief and conclude that, well, now things are not so bad and probably we don't need to fundamentally reshape the European Union. So both in the worst moments of crisis and when things are relatively good, concrete ideas for qualitatively changing the nature of integration never seem to materialize. To my mind, it speaks of something remiss within the model of integration. The fact that if you think about it over the last year, we've swung from one extreme to the other. This time last year, all the op-eds in the media were about the possible disintegration of the European Union, the possible collapse of the whole European model. Now, just 1 year later, it seems that leaders are once again ready to take a kind of really significant leap forward, and the talk is once again of completing the European project and even of creating a single European state. To my mind, there has to be something wrong, given the fact that we seem to have gone from one extreme in the debate to the other. So what I try and do in the book, and it's a difficult challenge, is to try and map out a position that's in between these two extremes. One extreme, the kind of skeptic argument that says, whatever efforts leaders make over the long term, the EU is basically doomed. And the other extreme of the argument, which says the crisis over the last decade wasn't particularly serious. We don't need fundamentally new ideas. Leaders just need to make a little bit more political effort to push through the standard models of European integration. So what I do is to try and suggest something qualitatively different is needed, to try and map out an argument that is different from the standard debate of whether we need more Europe or whether we need less Europe, and instead argue that what we actually need is a qualitatively different process of European integration. I argue that this is necessary because what the crisis was about at its root was the fact that citizens feel increasingly disempowered and lacking in influence over European decisions. They feel increasingly distant from the most important decisions that are being taken at a European level that affect their daily lives. And it was about diversity, the fact that the crisis revealed a growing variation, a growing discrepancy across different European countries in terms of economic needs, political preferences, and even social norms and values. And it is because of that, those fundamental driving causes of the series of crises that the EU has suffered in recent years, that a reset Europe, in my argument, has to be much more participative, much more inclusive of its citizens, and also much more flexible. There is, I think, a deep-seated sociological reason also why this is necessary. In recent years, the nature of European societies has changed out of all recognition. The relationship between individual citizens and the state, the basic models of social organization have undergone fundamental change. But the basic institutional structure of the EU has not evolved to keep up with these social changes. The basic institutional structure we have today is still the same, basically the same structure that existed when the EU was invented 50, 60 years ago. So it's hardly surprising that then we see a kind of fundamental, a constant tension between these formal institutional structures on the one hand and a new emergent social reality across Europe on the other hand. Because of this, my basic argument, if you had to summarize it in a single line, is that the whole rationale of the EU needs to change, that the EU needs to change from being a project of reconciliation between nations to one of democracy amongst citizens. Okay, it needs to change from having this rationale of reconciling nations to being much more democratically inclusive of its citizens. The question then is, what would this democratic Europe really look like? Here there is a problem. In general, pretty much everyone agrees with the proposition that Europe needs to be more democratic, the EU needs to be more accountable and participative. But this is not a very tangible aim. It's not a very concrete objective. This means that whenever leaders meet in the Council, in their big summits, the kind of issues they talk about are very much more immediate and tangible. The next bailout with Greece, the refugee relocation quotas, things that are very immediate and urgent. They never sit down and talk about the issue of how to make the EU democratic, even though in principle they all share this objective. Now indeed, we're, in a way, the debates, in a sense, are going backwards in terms of the focus on democratic legitimacy in the EU. Because after the crisis, leaders now seem to be talking again in terms of a practical union, a union that can deliver concrete benefits to a citizen. Those people here will recognize these are arguments, again, much more based on the concept of output legitimacy, the EU showing it can do concrete, tangible things, rather than it being openly democratic to its citizens. So what would a democratic Europe look like? One important fact here is that the EU's democracy problem is not simply a matter of the democratic deficit. The classical understanding of the democratic deficit, as everyone here would have studied it, the fact that nation states have given up powers to the European level without commensurate means of democratic accountability being transferred from the national to the European levels. It is not, the democracy problem is not just about that classical democratic deficit. Why? Because democracy also at the national level in all member states is underperforming. It's performing badly. It's generally agreed that there is a disconnect today from formal institutions at the national level and national citizens. and that citizens in all countries seem to be losing trust and confidence in their national democratic institutions as much as in EU-level institutions. What does this mean in practical terms? It means that the normally suggested solutions to the democracy problem no longer suffice. The normally suggested solutions of giving more power to the European Parliament or more power to national parliaments are not going to have a significant impact if those parliaments themselves are rather disconnected from their citizens. If citizens find it difficult to influence in any meaningful way parliamentary procedures at the national level, let alone the European level. The result, the implication of this is we need an understanding of democracy that's much more open-ended, much more participative, and takes on board rather newer ideas of how to inject democratic dynamism and legitimacy into the European political system. My suggestion, my basic suggestion to this end is that the European Union needs what I call a compact of European citizens, a compact of European citizens. This is my kind of concrete contribution to the debate, which suggests that there could be a large number of democratic fora across Europe that would be set up to involve ordinary citizens on a regular basis, within which citizens would be selected on the basis of random selection in many of these fora. They would exist at the local level. These would feed into the national level, in turn feeding into the European level, so that European level deliberations are much more organically connected to people's day-to-day concerns at the local level. I suggest in the book that ideally this network of democratic fora across Europe would be plugged into formal institutional efforts at EU reform. It recognises that in practice European governments may refuse to listen to these more open-ended and participative forum and show themselves too conservative to respond in any concrete way to this new network of democratic deliberations, in which case I think today there's a strong case for these kind of fora taking place outside the formal institutional processes of the EU. But basically, the idea is that this form of democratic participation needs to be much more dynamic, much more inclusive, much more open-ended, and give citizens a much more proactive possibility of suggesting new ways of doing European cooperation. What these fora shouldn't do is simply be asked whether they agree or not with reform proposals that are coming at them from a more top-down direction within European, formal European institutions. So that's my basic, most significant idea in the book, this compact of European citizens. In practical terms, the thing that is closest to resembling this proposal at the moment is the idea of President Macron to set up a series of democratic conventions across Europe. I suspect most of you have probably heard of this idea. This idea is actually being fleshed out right at this moment, and these conventions are due to start over the next few months. So the fact that these conventions, or consultations as they are now to be called, may begin within the next few months is clearly a very positive step forward. It does seem to denote a recognition on the part of European leaders that something more tangible needs to be done to inject a sense of democratic momentum. My proposal goes a bit further than these series of consultations at the moment envisage. The idea at the moment with these conventions is that they will last for a finite amount of time, for a few months only. They'll still largely be controlled by the formal EU institutions. And so what I'm arguing for, to some degree, resembles the kind of process that will take place over the next year, but actually goes further than what's on the agenda at the moment in terms of including citizens and giving them the prospect of much more concrete influence over EU decisions. So I think I'll wind to a close here. That's my most kind of basic proposition of how to, in a very concrete way, try and inject a degree of democratic legitimacy back into the EU. The book suggests two other pillars to EU reform that we can perhaps debate in the questions and answers. One is the suggestion that we need new ways of thinking about flexibility within the EU. Many of you will know at the moment there's a lot of debate on the agenda about the EU moving towards a two-speed model of integration. My book argues against this two-speed EU model, which it argues could actually set up some very divisive dynamics in the EU, and instead argues for a much more a much more flexible understanding of how we need to inject greater flexibility into the EU. And in particular, it argues that the debate over a more flexible Europe needs to be joined much more with the debate of how we make the EU more democratic and more participative. And then the third pillar of the book is quite a long chapter on foreign and security policy, which we can talk about if this is an area people are more interested in, which makes the basic argument that the crisis over the last 10 years is as much about the international dimension as it is about what's happening uniquely within the EU, and that foreign policy and the security policy dimension is today part of the EU's own internal crisis, and therefore that this should oblige the EU to rethink the whole way it does foreign policy and security policy. So those are my basic three propositions. In conclusion, I would say one final thought, which is that often when people make the argument for a more democratic EU or a more flexible EU, people have some doubt that this could translate into a more minimalistic European Union. I'm not making that argument. My argument is not for a scaled down degree of ambition. It's not for a minimalistic Europe of the nation states. That's not the argument I'm making. In a way, it's exactly the opposite, that by making its political process more democratic and more participative, its basic model of cooperation more flexible, over the longer term, this is likely to make integration and cooperation much more sustainable and much stronger and much more able to resist the next crisis that the EU suffers. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your flexibility. So we have Kalypso who has commented and elaborated a lot on how to reform Europe. I think in your book, European Stories, you even go for a new European narrative. You have coined your concept of democracy, where you see, or you encourage us and citizens to view Europe not only as an incipient state, but as a union of peoples who govern together, but not as one. And you have, of course, also written on, or elaborated and identified justice deficits in Europe, and also commented on its post-colonial legacies as an international relation actor. And Stella, you are a member of the Center of European Research, senior lecturer here in public management. You have worked intensively over the past few years over the Greek crisis, the consequences of austerity politics, and the link as well with Euroscepticism and populism. So the floor is yours, Kalypso.
Right, so we have to project, so we better get out, especially when one is very small. And I just want to say that when Sarah and Richard invited me, I was so happy to take part. I have to admit that I'm biased. Richard is a friend and a co-author, and we've thought a lot about these issues together. So you won't be surprised that we're on the same wavelength. And indeed, when I read the first draft of this book, one of the many things that impressed me in the book is that, Richard didn't stay in his ivory tower. He went and got his boots dirty. So he speaks now of social movements and all that, but if you'll see in the book, there is, in one chapter in particular, but others, a great exploration, a journey, what's going on in the underground within the protest movements and the involvement of citizens in Europe. What do they do, what do they say? And that's really, fun, because we might all know it, one way or another, but he puts it all together. And you want to shake well, and then say, hey, that's Europe. And indeed, the book is great because it combines realism. Let's start with where Europe is and what citizens do, with imagination and new ideas. And in fact, I was wondering, Sarah, because I haven't yet had the pleasure to see the exhibit. So you've put together these two moments. And my first kind of question, because after all, I praised the book, that's done. Now I want to ask some hard question. You'll forgive me, Richard. And, you know, one first question almost to the organizers, how does the notion of 60 years of history of the EU, which often, you know, we do these anniversaries, and there we were all in Rome with Europe flags and all that, but these anniversaries themselves are part of a story which tends to be about, you know, the ever-advancing Hegelian march of European integration, and we're 60 years, and it just moves on, and yes, there's a blip, but then now we're back on track. So I'm sure that's not the way the exhibit is presented, but I'd like to kind of hear about the contrast, because obviously Richard's book is very non-deterministic, non-teleological, as he said himself. And so, Richard, then, I want to, you know, ask you two categories of question. One is your diagnosis, because if you want to reset something, it means the clock is not working anymore. And the other is, you know, exactly what is to be done. Now, in the diagnosis, now, you say we're a fork in the road. The question is, aren't we always in a fork in the road in life? You know, every moment in time, like, okay, I could go left or right. And very often, you know, because of the Monet quip, you know, Europe advances in crisis, but lots of things are crisis. And you say, well, you know, we could do this or that, and if we don't go this way, then it's the end of the world, and if we go this way, that's the right road. And, you know, doesn't the story of European integration teach us that indeed we may be radical in our mind, but change is always incremental, and it's not about a fork in the road. And indeed, what is the lesson of Brexit in that, you know? Last year, or a year and a half ago, we were saying what you say in the book. Brexit is a wake-up call. My God, an existential crisis. We now realize Europe can go backwards, not just frontwards, or disintegrate, or have less. But now, paradoxically, as Britain plays the sacrificial lamb, the scapegoat of European integration, you listen on the continent, and it's all about, thanks to Brexit, we're okay. Because they woke us up, now we're awake, and we can do our thing and integrate, so, as usual. So Brexit, paradoxically, reassured rather than woke up. So it's kind of this fork in the road. Secondly, you quickly passed over the global, but of course, we're embedded in a global world. And I was wondering, you know, you want to be ambitious and democratic about Europe's foreign policy. But isn't the real, in this world of transition, of conflicts and of transition of power, of the core of power in the world, isn't the only challenge for Europe to manage its own decline elegantly? That would be, you know, if we could do that, that's enough. And maybe injecting a lot of democracy in that may be counterproductive, including because it wouldn't be that elegant, and it would be possibly more about Fortress Europe and no refugees, you know, go and die in the Mediterranean Sea. You know, we Greeks, you know, don't like this very much, but there we go. So, and then the third kind of question about the diagnosis, you said right now, this very interesting bit of the book, we say, well, you know, there's the societies of Europe, and then there's the institutions in Brussels. And there's a disconnect between the two. Not just that they don't speak to one another, or the institutions don't really know how to listen, or that the elites are there in their iron cage. My favorite metaphor is to use Weber's iron cage. You know, the elites have become this kind of bureaucratic state at the European level, but an iron cage in a bubble, because that's the Brussels bubble. Now, the metaphor is a bit, you know, difficult, iron cage in a bubble. But okay, we have this iron cage in a bubble, and but what you really want, what you say is that the real need for Europe is not either to engineer convergence, as they are obsessed with in Brussels, nor is it, as Theresa May would say, to manage divergence, the whole Brexit agenda. No, it's to manage differences and not to try to go converge or diverge. But we have differences in all sorts of ways, we have to manage them. And this is maybe a difficult exercise, but that's what the game is about. And of course, as Sarah mentioned, I couldn't agree with you more. I believe in this vision of Europe as a democracy, a union of peoples who govern together but not as one. But the question for us who believe that, in this kind of unstable equilibrium, managing differences, not convergence or divergence, becomes, what is our diagnosis about what European people want? And in the book, you say general things about this, but I just want to push you one step further in asking, one way of asking it is whether the Brexit mindset is exceptional or is it universal in Europe? And one way, one of the hundreds of ways, and of course I'm sure in this room, faculty and students have spent hundreds of hours writing and discussing the why of Brexit. But one question for us about British exceptionalism is to see that, citizens there are two bits to the European integration story. There is the content, doing things together about climate change and about money and capital and taxes and all of that, policies, versus the form of European integration. How much do we force states? How much coercion is there? How much centralization? And one great message of Brexit is that, and if you look at the polls, that yes, people actually want more cooperation and even want to give their opinion about this. What they don't like, so they like the content, but they don't like the form. And perhaps, so the question becomes, is that the case, is it exceptional in Britain, or are we talking about, to different degrees, European citizens writ large? And if it's the second, then how do we start thinking about, the reforms you're talking about? Okay, so that's kind of the diagnosis, but of course this last question leads us right to what is to be done. And you have this very potent, persuasive advocacy of a democratic management of interdependence. Absolutely. Now, I was intrigued by the fact that you called on Macron's democratic convention, because I thought you would kind of oppose them. Why? Because a big point of your book is that this is not a quick fix. We can't just, boom, do it. And what does Macron think? Okay, I'll ask you guys, don't you think it's a bit of a quick fix? Oh, we'll have the democratic conventions. I'm speaking, I'm playing devil's advocate. But if you listen to some of the critiques in France, you know how he did it, became president. He got all these people super enthusiastic, and they called themselves les marcheurs, the walkers. We're all marcheurs. But then he's got these people to walk and go door to door and interview, 300 people, citizens, and make a program bottom up. That was the whole point about Macron, and why he galvanized, his quickly created base. But lo and behold, what do we see now? I mean, he governs France with maybe 2 or 3 people around him. At least that's what he did. I mean, it's not like the spirit of Les Marcheurs has been sustained. True, they say we're going to do the same thing for Europe now. We're going to send marcheurs all over France, and they're going to ask people, what kind of Europe do you really want? But, that there is a chat échaudé kind of what? What's the English version of that? Well, the French are like, well, we tried that, and now he's really not asking us what we want. Or maybe he is, and he will do it. But I guess I'm asking you, if you were Macron's advisor, and you believed in your quick fix, but that he's also a man in a hurry who wants his place in history, how would you tell him to implement your compact of European citizens? Especially given that the man, if you listen to his speeches on Europe, there are lots of ideas, lots going on. Some of them, he's read your book already. And including these conventions. On the other hand, he speaks of l'Europe souveraine, sovereign Europe. He hasn't he? Or my question to you, good old-fashioned idea of Europe, that more Europe, I am a European idealist, therefore I want more Europe and more centralized Europe to do all these things. And the idea, bottom-up, is simply to define my agenda, but then I'll do it at the top with my co-leaders. Or am I being unfair? And, does he really believe in a new Europe of diversity? And, if you think about these conventions, so what would they be talking about and how? Means or ends? What if they differ from the parliamentarians of En Marche, who are themselves often from civil society, etc.? Are there what we like to call preferenda, about expressing preferences and maybe literally voting on them? What would the internet's place be in all of that? And can it be productive? Under what condition? In the era of fake news. And then, of course, that's kind of what will happen. But then the second dimension, aside from what will and should happen at the national or city level or whatever, is that you insist in the book, and you have this wonderful phrase of European civismo, European civism, meaning that we care about the other. That I may be British, but I kind of care about Portuguese politics, and I may be Italian, but I care about Estonian politics. And I know something about maybe 3 or 4 politics around Europe. You can't ask for too much, you know. Remember, 28 names of ephemeral prime minister, a bit too much. But nevertheless, we're supposed to be involved in each other's politics. And indeed, I've been very into that question of how you do this, having just finished on. This is a plug, a little book on Greco that Stella would like, on Greek-German relations, mutual recognition lost during the Euro crisis, how the mutual ascription and perception of the other, with my friends Kira Garsu and Fabia Sternberg. And in that book, we explore, you know, how even though the prejudices and negativity get you to know the other, even though negatively, and then you go through atonement and want to make it better, as it were. And there is a whole cycle of prejudice and ascription and holding, and the Germans saying, we're the real heir of antiquity, and the Greeks saying, no, well, how can you steal it from us? And all of that. So these conversations don't have to be all lovey-dovey, you know, they can be tough. But this is a real, you know, challenge for you, for us, for those who think democracy, because democracy is not just about the diversity and respecting localism and all of that. It's super, super hyper-demanding. And you were saying this a moment ago. It's about, because that horizontal notion of really getting to know the other and internalizing some of their interests, not hugely altruistically, but to the point where if something hurts you a lot and it benefits me a bit, I will, you know, not do it. And that's, you know, we can't ask for more than that, but that would be already very far. Now, how do you get there? Is it about schools and media, mindsets, you know, desktop? How do we get there? How do we do it? And there's something in the book on that, but maybe you can say a bit more. And finally, on the how to, you know, in the spirit of Brexit, I just want to start and finish with a really unfair question, asking whether, you know, maybe don't you want to have your cake and eat it too, in terms of goals and concepts and philosophy, because you said that your book is about combining 3 kinds of goals for Europe, 3 pillars: democratic Europe, flexible Europe, and secure Europe. And I can't help but ask myself whether these 3 goals are not in real tension with each other, maybe even in contradiction, because secure, and it's a big thing with the French these days, this is how the nation state was built, to make citizens feel secure internally, through ways of combining them, and police and all the rest of it, and externally through war. I mean, and so making citizens secure has a cost and a price. It builds nation state. It's about nation building. But you are against Europe being a nation building project. Europe is a network of flexible connections between people. So maybe you create a risk by asking secure, while at the same time wanting it to be flexible, and flexible while wanting it to be democratic. Isn't that kind of a mixture too much of attention for Europe? Don't we have to make choices? On the other hand, you know, Brexit demonstrates that everyone wants to have their cake and eat it too. You know, the French these days, Macron was just here on Thursday, and where I was all involved with the French community. This is the French side, not the British side, you know, but there we go. And the French they want Theresa May to give chanooks and you know, helicopters to go and help the poor French soldiers in Mali, and a lot of, you know, intervention, military, etc. But when it comes to economics, no, I will steal your banks for Paris. So France is really good at having cake and eat it too. In French, we say avoir le beurre, l'argent du beurre, et les baisers de la fermière. So anyway, for those who don't speak French, there's even a third bit that you want. And so anyway, that's a set of questions, and in doing those, so I hope you understand that it's from the spirit of absolutely and 300% supporting your agenda and wishing your book the best of destiny.
Stella, maybe I will have to stand also,
Yes.
because, you know, I'll go this side for
Okay, so I'll sit this side because I need my papers in front of me. Okay, so thank you for writing such an interesting and provocative book. For me, it's provocative because I come from a different aspect of politics and European Union studies. So I'm coming from a much more institutionalist perspective, which means that I found a lot of what we are saying new, refreshing, but also I have a lot of questions. So very interesting, easy to read. I suggest that you read it, and it's also very informative because it goes through a lot of what has happened in the last years in a very, very easy to understand and describe, descriptive way. So certainly something to read. I have three points, I think, and it's around different themes of the book, and I will try to elaborate a bit on them. And I have some questions around the way you use some of these terms in the book, because I understand them a bit differently. So I'm wondering why we have different understandings here. So the first thing that I thought when I read it was that, is this a book about reforming the EU, or is it a book about the value of direct democracy? To me, the novelty of this book is exactly Eurocivismo, but it's the civismo aspect, the direct democracy. And I'm saying that because I think if you were reflecting on national politics, on what is happening at the European states, then it would be more fair, because this is where we would have to start with direct democracy. In the book, you describe how direct democracy has started in local politics, and I understand why. I would expect that the next level would have to be the states, our states. The EU is just an umbrella. So if we don't see direct democracy in the different countries, in the different member states, is it possible to see all of this happening at the EU level? And I'll come back to that in a minute. The next theme that came to me was that when you were talking about output legitimacy in the sense the EU is trying to bring about results, policy results, growth, more security, whatever they're trying to do right now to show that, you know, they're still there and they're kicking and they're important. So you're saying, when you're talking about output legitimacy, it seems like you're criticizing the EU for doing too much in this field without thinking of the next step, how the institution should change. But then, when you're talking about what the EU is trying to do with bringing the people in, democratic initiatives, then you're saying that they're doing too little. So somehow I found this a paradox. The EU, in some parts of the book, is doing too much. In some other parts of the book, is doing too little. But they're doing what we've given them the mandate to do. It's the states that gave the mandate to the EU to do what it does. Okay, EU institutions have managed to have some more independence through the years, but at the end of the day, and especially through the crisis, and you describe that very well in the book, it has become more in the governmental. So the EU institutions are asked to bring proposals, solutions, but everything has been happening in EU summits of prime ministers, or in the Eurogroup, or in the case of the EMU. So this is the second aspect. The third is about the security issue. And I don't know so much about security because I don't work on foreign policy, but you describe there what the EU should do, that the EU should also start reflecting on what is happening outside, not just trying to promote policies, foreign policies, and the normative Europe, but also try to start absorbing what is happening, and you give examples from Brazil, Latin America. But there is one more thing happening out there. There is a global trend towards more autocracy, and large states like Russia, China, Turkey are managing to actually promote policies without having this democracy at home. So, and this is actually coming also in the EU, and again you describe this very well when you talk about Hungary, Poland, and how we see liberalism growing there. So again, this is a paradox. We're talking about more democracy, more flexibility, but the global trend is different. Will Europe manage to survive? And this is close to the point that was made just earlier about these different tensions. So these are the main the points. Now, some questions about some of the terms. So you start describing this multiple crises, and again, this is very well done in the book, because we're talking about the Eurozone crisis, but we're also talking about the immigration crisis, BREXIT, a lot of what has happened in the last years. And then the conclusion is that it's the EU structure that needs to be changed, and that this is what we learn from this crisis, or this is what we should learn from this crisis. What do we mean by EU structure here? Because when I try to understand the causes of this crisis, EU is just a small bit of the causes. Maybe the EU is not managing to provide the solutions that we would like to, but most of the reasons, most of the causes for this crisis are either at the national or at the global level. For example, immigration. The immigration crisis that we have been facing in Europe is because of global, of crisis, tensions that we have in the borders, Syria. Okay, maybe the EU hasn't managed to find a solution to this or to have a common immigration policy to solve this, but can we blame the EU structure, the integration process, for not solving this? Yes, for the EMU, maybe it's easier. The European Monetary Union has not been properly integrated, we would say, to have a common economic policy, so there I can see it. But again, the economic crisis and the EMU crisis started from a global crisis that started in the US, and a lot of it, at least in the Greek case, was because of domestic reasons that we couldn't, solve some of the problems. It's not all about the recipe. It was also how the recipe was tried to be implemented. So this is about the structure. The next one is about the solutions. There you're trying to say that we shouldn't go more with centralization. There the terms also become fuzzy for me, because centralization is different to a federal vision of Europe, which is what is discussed at the moment. So a federal vision of Europe is not a centralized Europe. So having a federal state doesn't mean that policies are taking place at the center. Yeah, we all know what federalism is, but I see that very often being brought together. So whenever we talk about further integration or federalism, it means centralization in the EU institutions. No, it could mean something completely different. Federalism is not necessarily about centralization, or at least this is what I think. It could be that a lot of the policies are still made at the national level, but you have some cooperation at the EU level. It could be co-federation. So there are many other visions there that are not so centralized before going to the networks and to the different, to the complete flexibility that you are suggesting, that I would like to hear more about. And then, I guess because I have already talked quite a bit, it's about the convergence. So this is a very interesting chapter because there are many proposals about divergent Europe. And there is a discussion there that we shouldn't insist on convergence and that we should allow more divergence. But what do we mean with convergence? Again, from an institutional perspective, what we meant all these years with convergence was just economic convergence in order to manage to have equality among societies and to be able to discuss other types of convergence. So political and cultural convergence were never explicitly in the agenda. Of course, with Erasmus, with projects like exchanges, best practices, yes, there was a little bit of that also. But the main aspect of convergence was about economic convergence in the sense of managing to have economies in the same level so that we can actually have a stronger union. And this is where there are some very interesting propositions about flexibility that we didn't have the chance to discuss, about opt-ins rather than opt-outs. I'm wondering what would this mean in practical terms? Because if you have opt-ins, it means that peer pressure is lost. So countries don't have, when they negotiate, they don't have to push each other for more. They have to just relax and wait for less. Then there was this idea of policy alternatives, so that we don't have fixed rules, but we have more targets, and countries can go and do what they want in order to get the targets. This is more or less what we have with directives, and it looked like member states didn't implement the directives, and that's why directives became more like regulations. Yes, I agree, we have to go back to more something like directives, but this failed in a way, and we had to go to regulations. Diversity within states, this is another very provocative idea, so that not all regions should necessarily follow the same patterns. Reversibility, this one I found quite challenging, because this one said that member states don't have to always follow what they agreed with in the first instance. And that we should allow more flexibility for countries to change their mind after they have agreed something. Should this also apply to international law then? Do we change the way we see international relations in general? Interesting. And then citizens' oversight, we already talked about that, and flexible solidarity. And I'm okay. Too many questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Kalypso and Stella, for your provocative question, and I think quite covering a wide range. I'm hesitating due to the time, but I think given that you have covered a lot of points, could we have a quick reaction from you and then open the floor for questions? And it's not fair for you, but if I could ask you to be brief in this first reaction, because I'm sure it will cover other questions.
Okay, try to be very, very selective and just draw out a few very general points. Kalypso raised a very important general point. The EU is always at a fork in the road. Am I simply overstating the severity of the crisis over the last few years? I think it's a good point, and I hope I'm not being too apocalyptic. In fact, I'm explicitly arguing against this in the book. This time last year was interesting. 3 or 4 books came out which were talking about the EU and obituary, after Europe, kind of books basically saying this was the end of the story and the whole thing needed to be reinvented, and there was no real validity or solidity left in anything the EU was doing. I explicitly argue against that and say we shouldn't over-dramatize the depth of the crisis. Not everything has been lost during the crisis, but it does seem to me that the very fact that there's been so many different types of crisis hitting the EU over the last few years means that we can't simply think that as the economic situation improves, as we move into an upswing economically, that all the underlying factors that caused all these various crises have been dealt with. So we need an attitude somewhere between thinking that everything good about the EU has been lost on the one hand, and saying basically it was just a kind of temporal, cyclical crisis, and now everything will improve almost automatically. The question of whether Brexit or the UK is exceptional, to some degree, yes, but I think, to my mind, it's not. I'm not sure there's a kind of duality between the UK and then what everyone else thinks in the EU. I mean, perhaps the UK is exceptional, but in a way so are many member states, because there's such a diversity of what different member states, what different parts of populations want, that I think, again, that's why we need a degree of divergence, but divergence in terms of understanding people today just seem to want different things from the EU, different degrees, different types of cooperation, and trying to shoehorn everything into a centralised model in terms of kind of singular policies covering every single area. It's much more of a challenge to make work effectively today than it was before the crisis. Is the book really actually about kind of direct democracy rather than the EU? No, it's not. It's actually not a book advocating direct democracy in the form of referenda. What it's actually saying is, if we want to avoid a situation where we have referenda like we had in Brexit that seems to have had such damaging impacts, we need a much more ongoing participation on the part of citizens, so we don't get a situation where citizens don't have very much participation or understanding of what's going on, and then they're asked these really big existential questions on a yes-no basis that doesn't really provide you very smooth or nuanced forms of policy making. But the way I posed myself in writing the book was that there has to be much more of a linkage between these different types of democratic renewal on the one hand and the EU's problems on the other hand. That's what I tried to do in the book, to say, yes, there's a crisis of democratic representation across the EU, and there's the crisis of the EU institutional structures, and these are part of a single set of problems, and then they need to be addressed as such. And it still strikes me, as someone who works a lot on democracy, both within the EU and globally, if one goes to conversations, dialogues, conferences on democracy and different types of democratic renewal, generally the people who are interested in the EU don't go to these types of events. This is a completely different world from the kind of people who work on the EU. And then you go to EU events and the kind of people who work on democracy and different types of democracy are not there. So what I tried very, very modestly to do in the book is to suggest maybe what we should be doing is trying to join together these two different worlds, so that at least in the way we debate EU reform, we have a better understanding that there are different types of democracy, different types of legitimacy and accountability. In that sense, am I being too kind on Macron? Maybe, I mean, when I was finishing the book, he'd only just been elected and had kind of thrown out this interesting idea of having democratic conventions without really explaining what these would look like. Now there's beginning to be a bit more flesh on the bones. I think that the problem with these conventions, at least as they stand so far, is that in a way, as Kalypso said, that they offer the tempting thought that within 6 months of a few dialogues, citizens' dialogues around the EU, we can solve all the problems we have. Obviously we can't. That's why I say in the book that we don't need these kind of conventions that last for 6 months, produce one document that goes into the black hole of the EU institutions, nothing really changes, but all the governments can kind of tick off the fact that now they've consulted with their citizens. It has to be a much more permanent and ongoing basis. It still seems to me one of the basic ideas I try and explore in the book is that this argument that we need to democratize the EU is not new. It's been around for 20 years, 25 years. I mean, as far back as when the Maastricht Treaty was being agreed, people were already saying that elites had got ahead of the citizens and that these ideas for getting more democratic legitimacy into the system had to be taken seriously. So there are lots of documents, lots of reports which say we need to listen to the people. It strikes me that the basic problem is that they're all back to front, and this I think is probably the problem with Macron. In general, you read a report that says about the way the EU needs to be reformed, and you have chapters on the single currency, on migration, on foreign policy, which all propose the standard set of EU reform templates, and then there's a little chapter at the end which says, oh, and we need to listen to the citizens. And it always seems to me that that's added as a kind of afterthought, and people have already decided what kind of EU they want before we get to this proposal of thinking about democracy or thinking, well, perhaps we should listen to the citizens. And it struck me that was a little bit what I didn't understand with Macron. That he came to power and laid out his 76 things that he wanted to see for deepening European integration, and then said, well, now we need to have these conventions for listening to European citizens. And it struck me that, well, democracy would be the other way around. I mean, we would have the conventions, we would listen to European citizens, and then we would try and design some proposals for putting those in practice. So it seems to me that everyone's basically in agreement with the fact that we need to have more democratic participation, but the way this is actually proposed often seems to me rather back to front. I think they're probably my main points. There's a lot more, but if not, people are not going to have a chance to...
Thank you very much. We will open the floor for questions. We want to have your reactions, your questions to Richard, but also Kalypso, Stella. So please, could you also state who you are and have a brief question, and we'll take maybe several rounds. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Philip Price. There was reference at the start of this session to locking into or becoming locked into all traditional tenets of integration. We're living in 2018. I mean, I studied this back in the 1980s, and one has to be very careful when you're looking at European integration. You're not just talking about European integration, you're talking about European cooperation, post-war European integration and cooperation. They're not the same necessarily. You have to look at critical phases of European integration. It wasn't always just about the Treaty of Rome or the European Cold Steel Community. One period which is often overlooked by commentators is the period from the end of the 60s, Hague, particularly focusing on the Hague Summit, December 1969. Now, a set of circumstances that have arisen by the end of the 60s which caused a major re-examination of the fundamentals. And there was a tacit realization that going down the road of hard and fast integration wasn't necessarily the right thing. In fact, there had already been setbacks in terms of integration, stemming from the original Treaty of Rome in terms of mid-60s crises, focusing on de Gaulle and that period, circa mid-60s. So what you really had, you had a very important critical period and a rebalancing institutionally at that stage. In the 1970s, going into the 1980s, you had, in a sense, a two-stage process. You had the original Treaty of Rome structure in existence, continuing to operate, continuing to function, but you also had an emphasis on intergovernmental cooperation. You had the setting up the European Council sessions at the top, and each fed into the European Council sessions. And this is a very, very important critical period, because there was a tacit realisation not to go far down the road in terms of institutionalisation and integration, but to have a much more fluidity, to build in much more fluidity into the European model. And it worked very well. It was, in my estimation of political scientists, I think at that particular period, there was a much more balance, a much more careful balance attained, stemming from the Luxembourg and Copenhagen reports of the early 1970s, setting up, for example, of the European political cooperation machinery. But European political cooperation machinery remained foreign policy cooperation, and that was on an intergovernmental basis. You had fiscal committee, you had secretariat, etc., and it was a logic. You also, in terms of defence, remember, that period of time, you had the second organisation, the WEU.
How you suggest?
Well, I was going to lead on to how does the author feel about the winding down, so to speak, of the WEU, the Western European Union treaty-based organisation at the end of the turn of the century? Because there must surely be people in Whitehall who bitterly regret winding up with the original WEU treaty.
Thank you very much. And yes,
Mario Mendez from the School of Law here at Queen Mary. My question might actually be answered in the book, and unfortunately I've not had a chance to look at it yet. When you refer, sorry to Richard actually, when you refer to how to make the EU democratic is not something they sit and talk about, which I understand to be the EU leaders in this particular context. I wonder to what extent we should be linking this, of course, to the experience that they had when they did sit down and talk about it, which of course is the Constitutional Treaty, and then obviously the really difficult ratification process that eventually leads to the Lisbon Treaty. And so it seems to me that in an EU of 28, soon to perhaps be 27, of course, that you face the particular difficulty of the EU's rules of change and how you implement any future reforms. So when you talk about these directly deliberative fora, I ask myself the question whether these directly deliberative fora that you're referring to are going to be accommodated within the treaty revision structure. Are we going to revise the treaties to incorporate these things, or are they operating outside of the treaty text somewhere else? If they're operating outside of the treaty text with a view to future proposals for treaty reform, for example, or future legislative proposals, I then wonder about how they relate to the existing direct democratic instrument that exists at the EU level, which is the European Citizens Initiative. Again, I point out that I haven't read the book, so it may be the case that you link the directly deliberative fora that you're referring to that particular instrument. And then I couldn't help but note that later on when answering a question, you suggested that you were not advocating referendum as partly a mechanism to avoid problems that have arisen with referenda, and obviously the Brexit one springs to mind. very, very unlikely that any future revision to the treaties that sought to enhance democracy at the EU level could avoid needing to surmount referendum hurdles at the level of any of the member states, which strikes me as precisely the reason why the powers that be, the EU leaders, where I started this question, how to make the EU more democratic is not something we talk about, it's precisely because it's very, very difficult to deliver any future revision that would incorporate such things.
I will take one last question. Heidi?
Thank you very much. Heidi Mauer from the London School of Economics. Thanks for a really interesting panel and also for the discussors, I think, for already raising a lot of different questions. I have to apologize, I also didn't read the book, but there are two things that struck me while listening. And the first one was that none of you actually mentioned the convention and the constitutional draft treaty and this attempt to bring a different way of Europe to citizens, which was then rejected in 2005 by the Dutch and the French. Was this just the wrong way, or what can we learn from this experience for the examples that you're giving? And my second question comes a bit from my own experience. I'm originally Austrian, so I was just told we had elections, we got a government. Apparently, this government is what the people want. And I was talking to people, and I don't seem to really agree that what the government does and what the people voted for is what people want. So, from your perspective, how do we make sure that people actually know what they want? And I'm talking about this short-term, long-term perspective. And I think it goes a bit in this direction of, well, if you ask people, they want secure Europe, but they also want to travel freely. So how do we make them sure that when people are involved and are discussing and are getting what they want from European cooperation, how do we make sure they make an informed decision? Thank you.
There is, I mean, if one talks about trying to make the EU more democratic, one often gets this kind of very sceptical responses that actually the last thing we need to do is give people more power. When we do give them the possibility to have influence, the choices they make are actually deeply damaging and prejudicial to European integration. I try very, very carefully not to paint a kind of idealised version of European citizens or suggest that we create a new fora and everyone is suddenly going to think in the same way and converge around a harmonious notion of European citizenship. It seems to me that precisely because there is this wide range in different views and this kind of creeping illiberalism across Europe, these differences need to be argued out, not because they'll produce any kind of magical panacea, but that if you look at the roots of populism that's rising, at least in some countries, that's driven by this feeling of disconnect between citizens and democratic institutions. So if you try and get round that by simply kind of jumping forward to a more integrated European sphere behind the backs of European citizens, it seems to me that's likely to compound the very things that have driven the populism in the first place. So the antidote to it actually becomes something that worsens the problems rather than betters it. I try and, in the book, talk about a kind of everyday theory of change for European integration rather than focusing on the big moments of formal treaty change or constitutional conventions, precisely to get around the focus on referendum. Again, because the sceptical response normally is having recourse to these measures of direct democracy, in particular referendum, is just deeply damaging, and people don't really know what they want, they don't have a good understanding of European cooperation. It seems to me it's only by this kind of regularised contact between citizens, maybe not initially on the big questions of kind of overarching treaty changes, but just how the EU relates to people's day-to-day considerations. I can see during the economic crisis that could have made much more of a difference. Always bearing in mind Kalypso's critique that one can't overload what one would expect from these fora, that you can't expect a magical convergence of how people understand problems, but at least you can get people into contact so that, Spaniards could have at least understood better why Germans had the policies they did and vice versa, rather than expecting we can come up with any kind of uniform understanding of European citizenship. That's really what I'm trying to get at. So we can at least address some of these problems before you get to the moment where you have the big treaty changes or the big referendum. And I do in the book actually talk a lot about the European Citizens Initiative and how it could be, I mean, its obvious shortcomings to date, and how it could be part of this broader process of change. In Brussels, if you go to people and ask, how should we make the EU more democratic, the answer you normally get is, we're already making the EU democratic because of the European Citizens Initiative. If people here have heard of this or studied it at all, it's an important initiative, it's very useful, it enables citizens to get together across borders and basically ask the Commission to consider legal changes, but in areas where the European Commission is already active, which is important, but it's a very limited function. And what I'm trying to do here is map out a much more kind of general and open-ended process of democratic change, which goes way beyond what the European Citizens Initiative does so far.
Perhaps two. I mean, one is to pick up on Phil's 69, and it's always nice to have the long view, absolutely. But did they really care about direct democracy? No. The whole spirit was let's resist supranationalism, yes, through indirect democracy, through the role of national governments at the center. That was the kind of the spirit of the late 60s, and then reinforced, of course, with the enlargement, the 73 enlargement. So what we're talking about now, and what we've been talking about for a long time, and what Richard tries to deepen in his book, is democracy all the way down. European democracy all the way down. Resisting the idea that, it's only the European Parliament, etc. So how do we bring European, it's kind of paradoxical, because Europe is up there, and how do you bring democracy all the way down? I think that's what our conversation is about. And indeed, it wasn't the case at the time for reasons we could get into. But when we do that, I think it is useful, Richard, maybe, when we look at the Citizens Initiative, and of course we are talking under the supervision of Mario, who is the world expert on the topic. So I wonder how you think, what lessons are there from how this Citizens Initiative hasn't been used, or how we can craft, and I wouldn't put the referenda in the bin. I mean, I agree with you that let's embed, European Citizens Initiative, which, of course, that's a kind of input for possible referenda. So you have these various kind of direct access, and we need to ask, well, how do citizens, think when they try to actually either demand through citizens initiative reform of EU policy or respond to referenda? I think we all agree that perhaps there needs to be smaller chunks. That's what you said. Maybe there should be more upstream when policy is made. All of these things. But then these questions come in, and now about how people make trade-offs, because that's what the world of policy and politics is all about, is trade-off and aggregation. And I would have thought that, you had a study at LSE very recently, right, where you went into great detail, your colleagues, into exactly how British citizens are making trade-offs about Brexit. And I was struck reading this stuff that, people are quite sophisticated when you really put it to them. But there's this, but there's that, how do you go? And they're kind of like going in the middle. People understand that there are trade-offs. And it's, the pedagogy. I think right now in Brexit, we're living a pedagogy of negotiations. I think exactly because it's on TV every day, the pedagogy of this craziness and this saga is exactly that people in this country are learning about trade-offs. So, of course, it's a bit sad that it takes a country leaving the EU to learn about the trade-offs between cooperation and control, or whatever. But I think we should have some sort of faith in this pedagogy, and that then helps with your paragraph.
Briefly, to support something that is in the book, I think, and Elizabeth was mentioning, he talks about this fora as a way of securing the ownership of whatever reform comes for the people, and I think this is really important because it's exactly the problem. If people don't feel that they have the ownership, then as we saw in the Eurozone crisis, then they don't see why they're doing it. But I'm wondering there, again, if we are in a, how this is going to happen. I mean, is this going to be, and this is integration process, or do you see this, as Mario was asking, as part of the treaties, of coming in as part of the process? So this forum would fit in which institution? In the Commission, in the Council? Who will take this, and what should they do with it? And that would be an interesting, to advance a little bit with what you're saying.
And can I add a footnote about the convention, because I had the luck or unluck to be part of that convention, and I really think we need to be careful in holding it as not that that's what you're doing, but as a model, because so much lip service was paid in 2002-3 to civil society. I remember that Giscard decreed that there would be 1 day of consultation with civil society, and then you had hundreds of NGOs, and they were asked to congregate in 6 different groups. Each group had like 20 or 30 NGOs, and then they each had to nominate a representative of these 20 NGOs. And then you'd have someone who would be all nervous and have their, 3 minutes of fame, and had to summarize and speak for these 20 NGOs. And only a few had the good strategy of making just one point. The others made some sort of big grand statement about how wonderful European integration was. So, missed the opportunity to put in something. The rest of the time, they had tables outside the convention, and I often looked at, who among the commissioners, went and speak at the table, and very few, did interact. Anyway, there's much more to say. I was hoping at the end of the convention that something would be created called Agora Europe, where indeed the citizens would be asked to look at the first draft of the constitution. And when we, the Greek delegation, proposed this to Giscard, he thought we were mad. He had absolutely zero interest in Thessaloniki. That was going to be it was a real concrete project. And there was zero interest among the elites and the presidium and all of that. So lots to say, but let's not make the past too rosy.
Okay. I suppose what I'm trying to do, quite contribute in the book, just to take the debate a bit further, 3 things. To say, at least get started. Let's get started on a few of these practical processes of participation without waiting kind of indefinitely for big treaty change. To understand that consultation is not just about consultation with NGOs who already have good access to EU institutions. That's not really democratizing the EU. And then to try and bring it down, as Kalypso was saying, to people's kind of everyday concerns, rather than expecting citizens to just come up with a whole new model themselves, but try and, it seems to me what we're missing, there's a lot happening in terms of democratic innovation and democratic renewal, but it's all very disconnected from what's happening at the EU level. So what I was trying to think through was, in a very practical term, how can we help at least take a few steps towards linking these different levels together? I know, was part of the original purpose of the ECI, but so far it hasn't really happened it seems to me, in any major way.
Okay. No, thank you very much. I think time is running. Unless there is, how many questions would there be? Just one? Yeah, okay, so that would be the last one because we want to have your opinion. And I just wanted, before taking your question, reacting on your question about the exhibition, because you raised, what kind of narrative we're putting, up front to our visitors after this event. And indeed, you will see, so it's an exhibition that is sponsored by UASIS, the University Association for Contemporary European Studies, and it draws its documents from the historical archives of the EU and the EUI based in Florence. So indeed, you will, when you go through the posters, you will see, a history and a narrative that draws from political campaigns on European elections, but also a lot of photos of the treaties, and of course, it narrates a specific, approach from political parties, from media, and maybe not so much from citizens. So I do take your point. I still think it's worth having a look, especially because you have one poster which is about the French European elections, or the European elections in France, 1979, that says "L'Europe est l'espoir," Europe is hope. And I think it's kind of an interesting way to document the narrative that has been built and to reflect upon it as citizens and academics. 2002. And I was amazed in the end how much we spend time discussing whether we should get a new president for the European Union. And I mean, reflecting upon those discussions, I'm just wondering if after all we don't have just a very state-centric understanding also of democracy, and if that's not the problem which has been raised. Please, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, sorry, I didn't expect to be the last one to ask the question. I don't want to reopen the whole debate.
It will be brief. We have drinks in 3 minutes.
Very good. Okay, I'm trying to be short. So I'm Renaud Tilliers, I'm a consultant on EU policy and regulation, but previously I worked at Policy Networks, a think tank working also on EU integration, and so I had time to think about all the things. I just want to ask Richard, and I'm, like others, I haven't read your book, so I apologize. But do you actually look at public opinion on this question of democratic engagement in your book? And I mean, is there accompanying evidence that more engagement or more participative channels is what Europeans want? And I'm asking this because, again, I've skimmed through the section on the democratic program, and you make the argument, like a lot of other people, that a lot of EU technocratic bodies, like the European Central Bank or perhaps the European Commission, basically are a bit far away from the public. But I mean, one also had the impression in some public opinion surveys that there is actually trust in these institutions to make challenging decisions. And here I would like to come back to Kalypso's point about the use about managing differences. And it's not easy, and intuitively people understand that it's not easy, and that's why we have these institutions that might not be democratically perfect, but at least they can make decisions and they can deliver. So sorry, but to come back here, it's really a question about, have you looked into public opinion surveys and people's expectations?
Yes, there's many articles coming out now basically questioning whether many European populations still adhere to basic democratic norms. There's a lot of concern there about the basic health of support of democracy across Europe. I do not go that far. I do not argue that people are losing faith in democracy. Some of the trust indicators in European institutions have stood up reasonably well, but you look across a whole range of surveys and indices, and they all show basically the same thing, that people feel increasingly disconnected and unable to influence decisions at the European level, but also at the national level as well, which is why I reiterate the point. It's not simply about the structure of EU institutions, it's about the whole notion of representative democracy, and it's in those terms that we need to frame the question, which relates to Sarah's point. It's not simply a matter of a few relatively cosmetic changes, like a chamber in the European Parliament or directly elected European President. They may be part of the equation, but those kind of measures, which is the normal way in which these challenges are debated, as far as I can see, would not suffice today to really address the depth of the problems we face.
Okay, well, thank you very much to Richard, Kalypso, and Stella for your insightful analysis and lively discussion of the book. I believe that you can buy the book. There is a table downstairs where we will have the drinks in the foyer. And I wanted also to advertise our Center for European Research seminar tomorrow with François Fauré. He's from ULB, and he will speak about European values tomorrow. Please go on Twitter, on Facebook to follow us and get more information. Thank you very much to all of you.